So today we want to begin with a tshuva from the Avnei Nezer, the Sukkot of a Rebbe, and it's quoted here, the Yalkut Bi'urim, on page Yud Aleph. Having a little trouble here with this wire. Hopefully we'll be okay. It says the following. Yesterday we discussed, in the context of our study of Shnios Larayos, we discussed various takanos, and we mentioned the Aruch LaNer, who divides the takanos into two categories. He's got siag, and he has takanos that aren't a siag. So the takanos of siag come under the mandate of the Torah, Su Mishmeres L'Mishmarti, and takanos which are not a siag are on a lower level on the hierarchy, and for those takanos, we would not be oker dover minat Torah. Now we tried to come up with an example. We have to think of other examples of what might he have in mind. Like, for example, let's say blowing chatzotzos would only be an iser mukta, which is not something that you can call it siag, apparently. Okay. So yesh chiluk bein takanos shehem siag l'Torah, bein takanos she'enam siag l'Torah. The takanos she'en siag l'Torah hismichum ala posuk u'shmartim es mishmarti. Harei ha'isur hu isur be'etzem. Higon ma'shenemru be'isur shnios larayos, which clearly come under the category of asu mishmeres mishmarti. That's explicit in the sugya here in Yevamot Daf Chaf Aleph, and that would come under a gzeira mishum siag. He says in that case, ha'isur hu isur be'etzem. Okay, we have to understand what he means by that. The Avnei Nezer was a big lam, really very profound thinker. And he says it's like the gufa isur, it's etzem ha'isur. Masha'enke takanot she'enam siag l'Torah, which are mentioned in the Gemara in the Masechet Shabbos under lo sasur, which Ramban calls an asmachta, but in any event, lo naseis ha'takanos ki gufa isur. What does that mean? Yisoda isur hu shelo lasur ulahamros pia chacham. That fundamentally the isur is to listen to the chacham. There's no logic, there's no fence around the Torah to prevent you from violating the Torah. The chachamim have to be obliged. You have to listen and fulfill their very will. Aval eno nepach lios gufo shel isur. What's the nafkamina? So far, very conceptual, very abstract. There are takanos which generate gufa isur because they are siag, and they're derived from mishmeres to mishmarti. And then there's another source or root for the chachamim and their authority to create new takanos that are not siag. They don't come under asu mishmeres, they come under lo sasur, but they're not gufa isur. Nafkamina le'inyan sfia lekata. Interesting. Now, I would like to go through this with you and try to be malbish what I call brisket terminology. I mean, the Avnei Nezer was not familiar with the brisket derech, but in many ways, he, on his own, came up with a derech that's very similar to brisk without the terminology. And he's talking about sfia lekata. This is sugya in Yevamos, in our Masechet, but later on in Daf Kuf Yud Daled. And the Gemara asks, are you obligated to separate a katan from, let's say, nevelos and trade? The katan is eating something that's not kosher. Are you obligated as a gadol to separate him from doing so? And the Gemara makes a distinction between to be mafresh him as opposed to be sofa biyadayim, meaning although if he, the child, on his own initiative took the nevel and treifa into his mouth, you might not be obligated to pull it out of his mouth and protest, but you're not allowed to actively feed him. The isur shu siag l'Torah, which according to the understanding of the Nezer is called etzem ha'isur, gufa isur, yesh lesar lisfos l'kata. That's what the Gemara in Yevamos has in mind, that you're not allowed to feed such a thing to a katan. Sharei masha osa katan, what the katan is about to do if you feed him would be usher for a gadol. Barehu bichlal iser sphere shel isurim. You're being sofa something that's usher, that's gufa iser to the katan that you're not allowed to do. Aval masha nesar midrabanan shalom mishum siag. So we're not talking about a siag l'Torah that comes under a mishmeres l'mishmarti. Let's say, for example, maybe muktzah is not a siag. That if you would violate this isur, you indirectly you're violating lo tasur, because the Torah says that you have to accept the authority of the chacham, and now you are rebelling, so to speak, against their authority. You can't say that in the case of a katan, he has to worry about lo sasser, and he's not allowed to violate the will of the chachamim, the authority of the chachamim. That's not relevant to him as a katan. You could talk about nevela and treifa, even if it's only the rabbanan in a siag situation. We have many cases of a siag of nevela, and that would be also supposed to be a dying, because had the katan been a gadol, that's exactly what the Torah prohibits, and those prohibitions in the guf hanevela that apply to a gadol now apply to a katan in a case where you're sofa b'yadayim. But in a case where we're not dealing with the siag and gufa isa, we're just dealing with accepting the authority of the chacham and not rebelling against the chacham. That's not something that you could apply to a katan at all. V'ein shayach b'zeh isa sphere b'yadayim. Kevin shemaisa kozelo nesar. Really, a gadol is not prohibited in that maisa. It's only that he can't rebel against the chachamim, but there's nothing inherent in the maisa that is asur. Is whole v'yeina kat mamre b'zeh espi hachachamim. So although a gadol would be mamre, he's rebelling against the chachamim, so that would come under lot asur. But in the case of a katan, he's not a mamre. He's not coming to rebel against the chachamim, and therefore you could be sofer b'yadam. I would like to try to put, the language, the terminology that I was brought up with, and be malvish it onto this avnei nesa. It's possible that when the Rabbanon prohibits something, it could fit under one of two categories. It's an iser hefta or it's an iser gav. When the chachamim are extending a doraisa, which is called a siag, the Avnei Nezer calls that gufa iser atzma. I would call it a chefta disura. To take a chefta disura, albeit b'rabbanan, and feed it to a katan, that you're not allowed to do. But when it comes to lo sasu, where there's nothing inherent in the object that's awesome, just as the chachamim said, lo sasu, we have the authority to do so. That's already in the gavra. Now we have to differentiate between the gavra of a gadol and the gavra of a katan. In the case of the gavra of a gadol, you could talk about an isur gavra. And the Torah says, lo tasu mipal yerucha. But in the case of a katan, where he's not shaykh to lo tasur and to rebel against the chachamim, then the Avnei Nezer is right. There's no isur to be sofa b'yadai because you're not giving him a chefta disur. Now, in the next paragraph, he presents the Netziv. The Netziv writes that from this sugya, it sounds like in the case of Isur Shniot L'Arayos, we have a remez in the pasuk, but with regard to the balance of takanos that the Chacham were mesaken, and the Torah tells them asus yad laTorah, einam nichlolim beremez. The remez is not in any way relevant to other takanos. It's all in the parsha of Arayos, of Shnios L'Arayos. And Rashi and Beitzim, explaining that the reason why Ein Botzim Gzeira L'Gzeira, Rashi says, it's because the pasuk says, Ushmartem es mishmartu. Darshu mikan shetzarich lasos mishmeres lemishmarti, but not a mishmeres to a mishmeres of mishmarti. And here Rashi seems to be applying asu mishmeres lishmarti universally, straight across the board, uniformly to all gzeros. He's not sensitive to the fact that the Gemara applies it specifically in a limited way to Shnias Larayos. Says in Itziv, ain't kavanoso. Don't interpret Rashi on a superficial basis and come to the mistaken conclusion that Rashi holds that Kol Gzera Shehu Misum Syad is included in the Remez of Shmarti and Es Mishmarti. So what does Rashi mean? Hello. Hey, because even in the case of Shnias Larayos, which is indicated B'derech Remez in the Pasuk Mishmarti, and even in that case, the Torah says, make a mishmeres for a mishmeres, but not a mishmeres for a mishmeres of a mishmeres, which is Gzera l'Gzera. And Kain Hu Adin, how much more so, where the Torah didn't specifically hone in and singularly mention the Arayos issue, how much more so lo yasa mishmeres li mishmeres, which is Gzera l'Gzera. And now he has a suffix in the Prima Gadim. The Prima Gadim lived, it's coming up on almost 2 centuries, 150 years ago. Brilliant thinker. Here's his song. What about a mitzvah aseh? Is there such a thing as a siyag mina rabbanon to protect the mitzvah aseh? He says the following. The source for asiyas siyag is ushmarta mishmarta. And he says the lashon of shmira applies specifically to a lotas. Right? We say that whenever the Torah says shmar, it indicates a lotas. Im kein nimtza shelo amra Torah lasos siyag el lemitzvus losaseh v'lo lemitzvus aseh. He has, for example, in the case of chametz, although the Torah prohibits it only midday of the 14th, the Rabbanan added 2 full hours before the Zman of Isur Torah. With regard to Hashbos, we don't find that you have to start Shvisa 2 hours before Shabbos. What's the difference between chametz, where the Rabbanan insisted on adding 2 hours, so that at the 10th hour already, at 10 a.m. on Friday, on Erev Pesach, you're already enjoying Midrabanan from Chametz, but we don't find that Shabbos, which begins at 6 p.m., that already at 4 p.m. you have to abstain from Malacha. What about the mitzvah of Shmisa? There's the Prima Gadim. In the case of Achila, the Rabbanan were afraid that if we don't add the extra 2 hours, you might come to actively violate the Torah law of Achila. There's Yom HaBa'unon, it's a cloudy day, and so forth. But Lo Hashbasa, She'ibet Shevi Altas. In the case of Hashbasa, what you're doing is, in the worst scenario, right, you will not abstain from Malacha. But again, that's also a problem of Shevi Altas. I mean, the Torah commands you to desist from Malacha and be in a state of Shvisa. That's a positive command. And we don't find a siyag for a mitzvah aseh because there's no asu mishmeres mishmar. Now, take, for example, Kriyat Shema. That's a mitzvah aseh. And yet, with regard to Biku Shalbacha, the Gemara says at the beginning of Masechet Brachos, that you have to recite Kriyat Shema before Chatzos Laila, even though the Torah allows you throughout the night. So here's an example of a Shvus D'Rabbanan, a Gzera D'Rabbanan, or to a Mitzvah Aseh D'Oraisa. And yet, according to the Prima Gadim, there ain't no such thing. There's no siyad for a Mitzvah Aseh. He says, Ein Zeh Begeder Siyad, Ela Zehirus B'Alma. Okay, for that we need a lot of study to understand the difference between a siyag and zehirus. For example, If, let's say, you came back from a banquet, a wedding, and you got back and it was after midnight, and you forgot to recite Kriyat Shema, or you didn't have Meir. Now they, Baruch Hashem, most focus after the chuppah, they have a minyan for Meir, but they didn't have a minyan for Meir. You came back very late, and it's after Chatzos. We're not going to say that you violated a D'Rabbanan if you recite Kriyat Shema after Chatzos. This is called Zehiris Bi'alma, that if all things are ideal, make sure to recite Kriyat Shema before midnight. Otherwise, you're going to fall asleep, you're going to forget about Kriyat Shema. But it's not Begeder Siyah. That's the breakthrough here of the Pri Megadim. Now, once again, I want to just review this Maral Miprag that I was stuck on last time. He says, the Gemara says, Kra Asmach B'Yalma, don't think that Shnius L'Arayos is Doraisa, because the Pasuk is only an Asmach. So the Maral says the following. It is a double negative. Ein Lomar, don't say that Lonis Kavna Torah B'Zeh Klal Isra Arayos. Asmach B'Yalma means that the Torah did not have in mind at all the Isra of Erva. Shem came, if that be the case, Amesh Shona Isra Shnius Mishar Gzeres Chazal. I mean, after all, we've been singling out the Gzera of Shnius and upgrading it to a special level, deriving it from a remez in the Torah, and now you're telling me that it's a smach to be alma. It's very anticlimactic. Why don't you just push Shnius L'Arayos into the general category of all Gzeros, and yet the Gemara upgrades Shnius L'Arayos to a remez min Torah. What does the Gemara mean when it says that this remez for Shnius L'Arayos is only an asmach? He writes the following: Yesh davar shehu guf haTorah, v'yesh davar shehu smach l'Torah. He gives a mashal. You can have a pri and a shomer l'pri. So if I ask you for an orange, I don't necessarily mean it's a peeled orange, although maybe that would be an upgrade, I don't know. But you give me an orange with a peel on it. The peel is considered part of the orange, even though its function is only shomer l'pri. And in the Nimshal, the pri itself, not the klipa, the shomer l'pri, is divrei Torah. That's ikar Torah. However, there is a d'Rabbanan. That's going to be the shomer l'pri. V'yesh lam asmachta b'Torah. Why did the Torah give an asmachta? Because the Torah was indicating that we need a shomer l'pri. If you don't have a how do you say in English, a klipa? If you don't have a peel, I guess we'd say, P-E-E-L. If you don't have a peel around the fruit, then the fruit could fall on the floor, it gets smashed, it gets squashed, and so forth and so on. So we need a shomer l'pri. Also, the shomer l'pri may protect the pri from other bugs and so forth. He says that this is what the Gemara means by asmachta. Asmachta means shomer l'pri. But again, it's upgraded to the level of being part of the pri. It's not the gufa pri. That's already the Dvar Torah. Asmachta means it's the shomer l'pri. The geder shmiras haTorah. The Torah is saying it needs a shmira. And if the Torah is telling you need a shmira in that asmachta, then the geder, the definition and classification of Shnius L'Arayos is that it is a shomer l'Torah, a shomer l'pri. Ukimoshe shomer shel pri mitztaref l'pri, b'shem pri olav. Let's say, today they take peels and they make chocolate out of it. You know what I'm saying? Orange peels. And it's chayiv in orla. Let's say, for example, you grow oranges the first 3 years of the produce, it's orla. That Isur Orla applies to the entire pri, including the shomer l'pri, which means the peel that protects the pri. That's also part of the pri. So we're certainly upgrading Shnios Larayos by one major notch by classifying it as a Shomer Lepri, as a Zahirus and a Shmira to protect the Torah, which is the Gufa Isur of the Arayos mentioned in the Torah. Ach gam divrei rabbanan sheyesh lam asmachta b'Torah harei heim mitztarfim l'Torah. So we have three levels. It's three tiers. You have Divar Torah, then you got down to the Smachta, and then you have a regular classic Gzerah Chachamim, which is not elevated to the status of Shomer Lepri. And a Smachta, like our Shnias Harayos, is a Shomer Lepri, and we said that the Klipa around the Pri is part of the Pri itself. Now, initially, when you learn this Maral, you feel a sense of philosophy as opposed to halacha. He's giving an upgraded status. Let's say you get on a plane, right? So you can have first class, and you have business class, and you have coach, and then you have the guy like me that gets put all the way in the back. But why is that relevant in halacha to categorize into different tiers these Isurim D'Rabbanan and put one, in this case, Shnias Harayos, on a higher level than the other, calling it a Shomer Lepri? It seems totally philosophical. However, in the light of both the Aruch HaNer and the Avnei Nezer, who were much later, by 3 centuries, beyond the Maral Miprag, we can now perhaps appreciate the Maral Miprag. And what does this upgrade of Shnias Larayos to the level of a Shomer Lepri mean, not in theoretical abstract terms, but in real concrete terms? And we'll start with the Aruch HaNer. Yesh koach b'yad chachamim lakar davar min haTorah. And they could be okir davar min haTorah in the case of a siyag of a smachta, that level of smachta, which is called the Shomer Lepri and has the same pri on it. But when you get to the bottom level of a classic Zeras Chachamim on the siyag, but it's not an asmachta in the Torah, and in the absence of an asmachta, it's not called a Shomer Lepri and it's not part of the pri, then ein koch b'yad chachamim lakar davar min haTorah. Applying the Avnei Nezer, the nafkamina would be whether you're allowed to give it to a katan, be a dayan. If it's upgraded to the status of an asmachta, which means, according to Maral Miprag, it becomes a Shomer Lepri that has the same pri, that you're not allowed to give to a katan. But if it's only a classic Zeras Chachamim, and it doesn't have this upgraded status of a Shomer Lepri, that I would be allowed to give to a katan. And the way the Avnei Nezer says it, it's only an Isur Gavra, it's not the Etzema Isur, it's only Marus and imposing the authority on the Chacham, and that doesn't apply to a katan.
So in the footnote there's a law.
Which number? Yud Ches?
Yud Ches.
Zudas minus. La Torah he either bekach u'mosra chiyuv adavar lekovo lechachamim yirtzu Moshe Nemar Yasisa al pi hadavar sheyagidu lecha ivatimsa chachamim nosnu b'chol makom raya o zecher o achmachtu l'dvei min haTorah klomar eina mechamshin dor milibam v'chol Torah shval per muzu b'Torah shmitzav shitmima v'chas he shehi chasera. Very long and dramatic presentation of the Ritva. basically he's saying that the asmachta really is giving credence and significance to the chacham. They're not just creating something out of the hat, something new, but rather it means that they are taking the mandate of the Torah, and the Torah throws the ball into their court to give them the authority to formulate the prohibition. But to say that an asmachta is only a siman l'tova, it's a way of remembering. Oh boy, he doesn't like that. Don't even say such. Somehow it comes from the world about Picarsis. Rambam, the muscle is safer. Safer at eight, but psicha close up. Mikadim she shnei mine asmachtos. Okay, that's a really. Now, in the Gemara itself, we got up to Daf Chav Beis Amud Aleph, approximately 9 lines down from the top. Tani debate Reb Chia Shlishi Shebno B'Shebebito. So now the Gemara is going back to Reb Chia. You may remember that in terms of the total number of Shnios Larayos, the magic number was 16. And only 8 of those 16 were mentioned in our Mishnah. And we have to find the other 8, which are indicated by the Bryce of Rabbi Chia. Now, we can reduce the number from 8 down to 6 because of Hani Tarte. Right, there were 2 cases of Dod Aviv and Achoskeno, which we put all together. And now we're looking for 6 categories of Shnius Larayos that were formulated by the Brisa of Rabbi Chia. We have Shlishi Shebibno and Shlishi Shebibito. These are going to be the first 2. And I think we're talking about great-grandchildren. He has a diagram number Reish Ches. He starts with Avram, goes down to Yitzchak. Yitzchak goes down to Yaakov. He has Avram, Yitzchak, and Rivka. Yaakov is the father of Dinah, so Dinah becomes the great-granddaughter of Avram. Rivka has a daughter by the name of Leah. She is the great-granddaughter of Avram. And Avram, in the case of Bas Beno Shel Beno Yitzchak, which is the great-grandchild, that's Dinah. Or as far as Leah is concerned, Avram's relationship is Bas Bito Shel Yitzchak Beno. So that's again a great granddaughter, and that's called Dar Shlishi. And so those are 2 of the shnios of Rabbi Chia. And then we have the Ben Ishta. So this is the granddaughter of his wife's son, otherwise known as his wife's great-granddaughter. Ushlishi again, Shlishi Shebebas Ishto. Again, it's the same thing again, a great-granddaughter, but not through her son, but rather through her daughter. And all the above, those 4 cases are Shnia. Now he has another 2 cases of Shnia, which is Revi Shebechamiv and Revi Shebechamos. So, of course, we're talking about a father-in-law or a mother-in-law, and we're talking about the mother of his father-in-law. And as far as the mother of his father-in-law, that would be shlishis, but the mother of his father-in-law would be already revius. And the same is true for chamos, which means the mother of his mother-in-law. And the wife, in that case, is a revius. And all this is included in the Iser Shnia Larayos. So now we have the magic number 6. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi Maishna Lemala. So both say, if it's okay with the olam, I would take a little bit of a break in the learning for today. Make a note of where we got up to. So we're going to pick it up in Ritzchem on Sunday, Yom Rishon, with Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi, Maishna Lamala, Maishna Lamala. Okay, then? So that's what we want to do. Now, what I would ask you to do now, if you can get a hold of a Rambam Sefer Tara. Steve, what do you have? You have a Tara? Okay, and John also has the Tara. Jeff, maybe you can get a hold of Sefer Tara of the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. And we're going to open up to the 18th chapter of Hilchas Kalim. Hilchas Kalim is massive. So it's Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud. So the Rambam says the following. Now the question is, a kli is makabel tumah, and what about shivrei kelim, a broken kli? So at one point, it was a complete utensil, and then it broke. If it still maintains its status as a kli, then it's makabel tumah. If it forfeits its status as a kli, then it's not makabel tumah. So the Rambam adds 2 important words. He says, Kol hakelim shenishbru v'nifsida tzurasa. Then ein shivrei makabel tumah. In other words, the Rambam feels compelled to add another condition to what we would call hafkas shem kli. It's not enough that it broke. What do you say? We're looking here in Tara, in the Rambam. Okay? So you can open up to Hilchos Kalim. You have the same edition as Steve. So, Steve, you can make a shortcut for him and tell him what page it's on, if it helps. Okay. Is then, once it was nifsidat surasa, it was shattered, then aim shivreim makablim tumah. Now, I'm thinking out loud that the word in English shattered is not appropriate for this Rambam. We're talking about a kli that broke into pieces. It's not totally shattered. And why do I say so? Because the Rambam writes, Afal Pisha Osam Hashvarim, those pieces, Ru'uyim Litashmish. Like, let's say, for example, you have a receptacle and it could hold, let's say, 3 lugim of oil, and it broke on the floor. But what happened is the top part of the kli broke off, but you still can put 1 lug of shemen inside the kli. And if it's a valuable kli, you're not going to throw it, into the rubbish. Says the Rambam, we have a kula, a leniency in Kabbalah's Tumah, that once the kli has been changed in a profound way, which is called nifsadat surasan, we can be makil and be mafkia the same kli such that it's not a kabul tumah, even though it still can function in its original capacity and its royal attachment. And that's going to be a kula in the laws of Kabbalah's Tumah, that once it loses a tzura of a kli, which let's say we would say a tzura of a kli is the way you would sell it on the market, the way it's manufactured, it has a tzura's kli, and now it's broken, but it still could function. Nevertheless, paka shem kli, and it's not makabel tumah. Now, watch it. Paka shem kli is a kula in tumah and a chumrah in Shabbos. What does that mean? If you're mafkia shem kli, that's wonderful in tumah, no longer susceptible to tumah, but it's a chumrah in Shabbos because you're not allowed to move objects that don't have a shem kli. You can move kalim on Shabbos, but tiltul of shivrei kalim, if the shever, the shvira of the kli, is mafkia shem kli, that's bad news. Because once you drop down to the absence of a shem kli, it becomes like eitzim va'avonim, like stones, which are not kalim, and they're muktzah. So the kula in Kabbalah's Tumah becomes a chumrah in books of Shabbos. That you were makil and you said, you know what? There was originally A plus B in this kli. It had both a tsuras kli and a tashmish of a kli. And now that it broke, it may have the tashmish of the kli, that's element B, but it's lacking a tsuras kli, that's A, and paka shem kli. That's a great kula in Hilchas Tumah, because it's not makabel tumah. That's bad news if you want to classify the same kli in Shabbos terms, because you're telling me that despite the fact that it has a tashmish, it has a function, but nevertheless, since it's nevda tzuras, it's not a kli. Well, if it's not a kli, then it's muktzah. So far, so good. I don't know if anyone's following. I can't read your faces. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, we go back to the drawing board in Hilchas Kelim, and the Rambam introduces what's called Mipiyat Shmua. Mipiyat Shmua in our context means that there's a separate new halacha that is an exception to the rule. It's going to be a chumrah of what's called kli cheres. And in the case of kli cheres, if it still has, even after the shmira, a function, then mipia shmua, it retains its shem kli simply because it has a tashmish, although it's of the tzuras and it would be makabel tumah. B'chol kli cheres mipia shmua lamdu shezelo ba el rabos shivrei kli cheres, meaning ribui that it's makabel tumah. In the exact same case where other kalim, like metal kalim, glass kalim, let's say, if you have a kli that's made of wood, in all those substances, once it was hefsei tsuraso, then it's not makabel tumah. This, despite the fact that it is royal tashmish, but in the case of kli cheres, we don't have that cool. We cannot be lenient, and if it's royal tashmish, then it retains its status as a kli. Again, only in the case of cheres, despite the fact that it's hefsei tzuras. Now that halacha, which is a chumrah of kli cheres in tumah, becomes a kula with regard to muktzah Shabbos. Why? Because if you're saying that a kli cheres retains its status as a kli, despite hefsei tzura, because it's royal shivush, then that would mean that on Shabbos there would be no isa tiltul of shmiras kalim if we apply kli cheres. Do we follow that? There's no isa tiltul because if it retains its shem kli, and this logic compels that it should retain its shem kli because it has royal attachments, then such a shivrei kalim in Shabbos would not be muktzah because it retains its shem kli, and kli is antithetical to muktzah. What gives the kli its shem kli? The fact that it's royal attachments. So in Hilchas Tumah V'Tara, with regard to all substances, all kalim, with the exception of kli cheres, the halacha is that we require tzuras hakli. It's not enough to tell me that it is functional. You need to have a tzuras hakli. The way you would normally, you go online, you get. You want to buy from Amazon, show me the pictures of the various kalim. I see a complete kli. This is a sheva. It's already broken. Maybe, I don't know, in some cheap auction house, you can sell it as damaged goods, but it doesn't have a tzuras kli, and therefore it's not makabel tumah. And don't tell me that it's royal. That's with regard to all kalim in kabbalas tumah. It's not makabel tumah once it's hefsei tzura. But in the case of a kli cheres, here we have a chumrah in tumah v'tara that a kli cheres is makabel tumah, even though it's past hefsei tzura, it's shivrei kalim, because it still is functional. It's not functional; it has no element whatsoever of kli. But we're talking about a kli cheres that broke, but it still is functional, and therefore it retains the same kli, and it's makabel tumah. That status of a kli cheres in tumah, which is a chumrah, based on the fact that it's royal shimush, becomes a kula in Shabbos. It's not muktzah because it retains the same kli by virtue of the fact that it's royal. Now, let's ask the following question. In the laws of kalim of muktzah on Shabbos, there's no distinction made between a kli cheres and other kalim. We don't find such a distinction. That's a v'pi hashmua in Hilchas Kabbalas Tumah, because Kabbalas Tumah is doraisa, The Avnei would call it Gufa Isur, right? And Muktzah is already a Drabanan. It's not even a Siyag. It doesn't even have an Asmach, let's say. So now Yesh Lach, when the Rabbanan established the laws of Muktzah, which criterion or which definition would they have borrowed from the laws of Tumah? Would they have taken the Chumrah of all Kalim? When I say Chumrah, I mean the Kula of Tumah, which becomes a Chumrah in Kalim, that meaning once it is royal Shimush, even though it lost it was mafsid its Turas Kli, it still retains. Just 1 second. It loses its Shem Kli. Why? Because of Hefsei Tzura, and therefore Shivrei Kalim would be Muktzah on Shabbos. Or did the Chachamim, when they organized the halachas, established halachas of Muktzah, they used the Kli Cheres as their paradigm, and that would mean that, again, in Shabbos there's no difference between one Kli and another, but it means that Shivrei Kalim on Shabbos, if they retain their function, royal Shimush, they retain the same Kli, and they're not Muktzah. And what we're learning now is the latter assumption, meaning the premise that we're going to try to prove is that with regard to Muktzah, on Shabbos, the Chachamim took the lead, they took their lead, their paradigm from Kli Cheres, which is a great kula. It means that in Shabbos it retains the same Kli and it's not Muktzah as long as it's royal Shimush. How do we know such a thing? How do we know that the Chacham took their their clue, is that the word? From Kli Cheres of Muktzah, of Tumah V'Tara? Because the Mishnah says in Masechet Shabbos Kuf Chaf Daled Amud Beis, Kol HaKelim Nitolim B'Shabbos, Shivreim Nitolim Imahem. Meaning, just like you can move the Kli on Shabbos, because the Kli is not Muktzah, so too you're allowed to move Shivrei Kelim, Ubilvad, Sheyu Osim Me'ein Melach. In other words, you can do some sort of malacha with the shever kli. Like, for example, you break a piece of pottery, and the broken, I think it's called in fancy English, a shard, can be used to cover as a bottle cover for, a wine, what should we call it? A wine. Help me out here with the English. Not a casket. What's it called? The flask? I don't know what the English word would be. All right, we'll call it do you mind if we use the word flask? I don't have a better word. If you have an access on Google.
Decanter.
Canter, oh, that's the word. How do you spell it? C-A-D-E-C-A-N-T-E-R. Decanter, it's probably a French word. Okay, I'm going to write that down. Decanter. Okay, so you have a decanter for wine, and you lost the bottle cover. We have this all the time in our house, and you could use a broken shard in that function as a malach. So it's royal shimush, and therefore it's not muktzah. Hence, we derive the conclusion that even though it doesn't have the tzuras hakli, it was hefsei tzuraso, because look at this broken piece of pottery. It's not like the original vessel. Nevertheless, it's not muktzah. You're allowed to be metaltaled on Shabbos because it has a function. And now what we're doing is we are borrowing the criterion of Kli Cheres in Kabbalah's Tumah and cloning it and applying it to Shabbos. That just like in Kli Cheres, we said that in Piyashmud there's a chumrah that it still retains its shem Kli and it's Makabel Tumah because it has a tashmish, even though it's Hefsi Tzura, in the exact same case of all kelim on Shabbos, we're going to say that since it has a tashmish and it retained that element of the kli, it maintains the chain kli and it's not muktzah and it's not asur v'tilt. So far, so good. And now we get to Rabbi Yehuda, because the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Chav Daled codifies the shita, the dissenting view, l'chumra of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says no. Bilvad sheyu osim me'ein malachta, meaning don't take a receptacle and tell me now that it's broken, I could use it as a bottle cap, cover my decanter. Tell me that I can still use it as a receptacle. It's got to still have the original function. That's what's called the Lishna Kam in the Gemara. The Gemara then has another interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda that has to do with Nolad and so forth and so on. Okay, then I'm just going to close the window for a second. Okay, I find this very interesting. I don't know if it interests you at all. It's very exciting to see how the Rabbanan decided, Oh. So now, he says the following. I'm just going to read this to you. He says, Al liba de Rabbi Yehuda, ein noeg din shivrei kelim, meaning the hetatiltal of shivrei kelim does not apply. Ella imkain hem reuyim l'ne'ein tachmisham. Ratzalomar, the original tashmish. What is the underlying logic of Rabbi Yehuda? Let's figure out a better way of improving the situation. First, he offers the following pshat. Rabbi Yehuda pligi al ikar din shivrei kelim le'inyan muktzah. The mehechi teisi l'damos es kol kelim le'inyan Shabbos l'kli cheres l'gabi tumah. Di adraba harei chazinon le'inyan tumah gufa di b'chol kelim, with the exception of kli cheres, shivrei kelim eino mitam. They're not makabel tumah. Valav kelim did. See, here's where I get confused, because Rabbi Yehuda requires me'ein malachtan rishona. I don't know if that means that you need a tsuras hakli. I don't know. This. Ubi ofen acher yesh lomar the sfirle the gam din shivrei kelim Liyintuma einon mitame mitoras kelim mamish, which, if I understand correctly, means that even in the case of a kli cheres, which we said would be makabel tuma even after shmira, that's not b'toras kelim. Elahu ribui b'fnei atzmo. I think when he means ribui, he means mipi hashmu. I'm not sure. The noeg din tuma gam b'shivrei kelim b'kli cheres. It's a din in niuk tuma. It's not a din in kelim. It's not that we're saying that a kli cheres, after it breaks, is still a kelim, which could have an impact on Shabbos. But it's makabel tumah. Kli cheres is makabel tumah. Once it breaks, it doesn't have a shem kli, and therefore in all kelim except for kli cheres, where we don't have a ribui, it's not makabel tumah. So shivrei kelim are not kelim. Kli cheres, that's a separate din. The Torah said that kli cheres is makabel tumah even after Shmira. But that's despite the fact that it forfeited its shame kli. So if that be the case, then Rabbi Yehuda is right. You have no right to be makil on Shabbos by saying, well, Pok Hashem kli. By saying, I'm sorry, you retain a shame kli. Because even in Tum V'Tara population, again, even in the case of Klicheres population, it's a separate halacha in Kabbalah's Tum. So that's what I have for today. This is where I got up to. So I appreciate that you were able to dip into this limud today. And if you're interested in the rest of this story, you'd have to come here at 4:40, or you could probably get it on YU Torah. All right, then. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a wonderful Shabbos Parshas Vayetze, and we'll get together in Mitzvah Shem on Sunday, and then after that, I'll be in a different part of the world for the balance of the week. Okay, then? Okay. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much.